Misthological Models Part 5, A Panoramic View of New Jerusalem. Chapter 6, New Jerusalem in the Future. Consider the duality of the war in heaven. Just as Lucifer and his fallen angels were cast out of heavenly Jerusalem to planet Rahab in a pre-cosmic battle, Satan and his fallen angels will be cast out of heaven by the heavenly Jerusalem to earth in the future. Consider the duality of the incarnation. The past war in heaven 1, at the gap, will be like the future war in heaven 2 in Revelation. As to this future event, a force field in the form of an interdimensional barrier tuned in to their fallen frequency and blocking that frequency will probably be placed around Earth to prevent them from leaving Earth and to prevent them from doing any dimensional shifting. They will be stuck in our 3D dimension. Let's focus on a section of the Bride of Christ wedding motif. Satan will be cast out of heaven and replaced by the Bride of Christ at the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation. These fallen incumbent rulers are removed at this point because the bride, or at least this portion of the bride, is now ready to take her rightful place as queen. She is joined by the 144,000 mentioned earlier in Revelation, who will perhaps add to the number of the bride. Migration of New Jerusalem, Part 1. By the time of the rapture, the 3D pyramidal city will be moved into a geosynchronous stationary orbit above Earth. This heavenly city will be cloaked from the 3D view of Earth. Satan and his forces will be able to see the city, but earthlings will not. Nevertheless, to hide its gravitational field, the city will remain on the other side of the moon until the moment of the rapture. Then it will move to this side of the moon, still staying cloaked from visible observation. This will mark the beginning of the day of God's wrath, which will last 10 plus or minus years. These new details have been marked in a different color. So I am modifying this chart, updating it from some of my earlier models. The beam is also denoted in this color since it is now being postulated as lasting 3 plus or minus years after the rapture until the time of the tribulation, which is a new detail. Migration of New Jerusalem, Part 2. Earth and the 3D pyramidal Jerusalem are shown to have moved on the prophetic timeline to the end of the Bema. Heavenly Jerusalem will still be cloaked above the earth and will remain in this location and cloaked state for the next 7 years until the end of the earthly tribulation and heavenly marriage feast. Those church age believers not found worthy of living in the heavenly city will be sent to the outer darkness. Migration of New Jerusalem, Part 3. Earth and the 3D heavenly Jerusalem are shown to have migrated on the prophetic timeline to the end of the earthly tribulation and heavenly marriage feast. Heavenly Jerusalem will no longer be cloaked. Migration of New Jerusalem, Part 4. Earthly judgments at the end of the tribulation will cover all believers, not judged earlier at the heavenly Bema. Consequently, these earthly judgments will deal with believers from all other dispensations other than the church age. Therefore, these earthly judgments will deal with all Old Testament believers, dead tribulational believers, and living tribulational believers. These unfaithful believers who already have died, and thus are now resurrected but are found unworthy of the city, will be cast back into the parabolic and typological courtyard, which would be other planets in the outer rim of heaven. Migration of New Jerusalem, Part 5. At the conclusion of the millennium, everyone not yet judged will be judged at the great white throne judgment. All rebellious believers who live until the end of the millennial kingdom will be involved in the rebellion when Satan is loosed at the end of the 1,000 years. They will all be killed in that rebellion. They will be summoned from the celestial outer darkness for this judgment. Thus, Satan will be used unwittingly to remove covertly rebellious believers from the kingdom by means of overt rebellion. God will use Satan as a broom to sweep these rebellious believers into temporal destruction, resulting in their mythological destruction. Migration of New Jerusalem, Part 6. Unbelievers will be cast into the lake of fire outside of the heavenly realm. Rebellious millennial believers will be cast back into the parabolic and typological courtyard, thus the outer rim of the heavenly realm, and reside in this celestial outer darkness for eternity. Both unbelievers and unfaithful believers are cast outside the city, as indicated in Revelation 22:15. Those who are soteriologically or mysticalogically described by that vice list are outside the city. There is no reason to reject the clear testimony of Scripture concerning the outer darkness on the basis of speculations that everyone outside the city must be lost. Migration of New Jerusalem, Part 7. After the first heavens and earth have passed away in a roar of fire, the 3D New Jerusalem will come out of heaven to the new earth. My speculation, as noted in the illustration, is that the 3D city will serve as the space vehicle for the stationary 4D city. Tribulational outer darkness. Unfaithful believers dying during the tribulation, and thus during the Bride of Christ wedding feast, are sent to the celestial outer darkness during the Bride of Christ wedding feast in a pre-bema sorting. Tribulational rapture. The 144,000 are Jewish virgins raptured halfway through the tribulation, while unfaithful believers are not. Unfaithful tribulational believers are left on earth at this midpoint partial rapture and not allowed to enter the heavenly wedding festivities. A partial rapture occurs at this juncture, but it is not the partial rapture typically postulated by advocates of the partial rapture position. Rather, the full rapture of church-age believers in 1 Thessalonians 5:9-10, at the commencement of the 10 years of the day of God's wrath, will be followed by a partial rapture at the midpoint of the 7 years of tribulation for those believers who are alive during the tribulation. Celestial and terrestrial outer darkness. On the outer realm, you see a picture of the celestial outer darkness. At the center, you see a picture of the terrestrial outer darkness. The rejection of unfaithful tribulational believers who live until the end of the tribulation will not be put fully into effect until the actual start of the millennial kingdom. These unfaithful believers will not be cast into the terrestrial outer darkness, that is, sent to live in the outer realms of the kingdom on earth outside of the promised land, until, at a minimum, the planet is rotated so that the promised land is at the top and the boundaries of the terrestrial outer darkness outside the promised land are determined. The rejection of unfaithful tribulational believers who live until the end of the millennium cannot be put fully into effect until the actual start of the millennial kingdom. For they cannot be cast into the terrestrial outer darkness until the planet is rotated so that the promised land is at the top and the boundaries of the terrestrial outer darkness outside the promised land are determined. In that regard, they are not cast into the outer darkness until after the marriage banquet has started. For unfaithful believers consigned to the celestial outer darkness, their ejection is immediate. Both details comply with parabolic expectations. For more information, you can see my website, accessible through either of these links, mythology.org, unconditionalsecurity.org, theouterdarkness.org. All three links take you to the main website. When you go to my website, you can see at the printed books a link that will take you to all of my printed books. You can find this book, for example, Misthological Models Part 5. If you click on the title at the top, this will take you to a PDF version which you can obtain. Or if you click on the cover, you can obtain the printed book or Kindle version.